My mother's hand slammed into my back before I finished saying, "I won't sign it." The ground disappeared beneath my feet. "I wish you'd never been born," she screamed behind me. As I fell, I saw my father grab the crystal birthday gift the caregivers had given me, not my hand. My younger sister, Chloe, stood beside him, smiling. Someone on the trail below heard me calling for help. Emergency crews found me on a lower ledge and brought me back up. The next thing I clearly remembered was waking in a hospital with a fractured pelvis, a badly broken ankle, and my family insisting I had simply stepped backward during an argument. 6 days later, while a therapist was teaching me how to move from the bed into a wheelchair, one of our longtime clients called. "Mara, your company says you abandoned 42 elderly people," Grace whispered. "They announced that you resigned and Chloe is the new CEO." My hand tightened around the bed rail. I had arranged coverage for every one of those visits before leaving for my birthday trip. "Don't call my family," I told her. "Save the announcement and check your mother's care records." Both of her mother's visits had been completed. So why did the company already have an exact number? I opened a notebook and began writing down everything I remembered. 6 years later, I would walk into my family's boardroom using a cane and place my purchase agreement in front of Chloe. But that morning, I owned nothing except my name, my memory, and one impossible question. Who had counted the damage before it happened? 6 days earlier, my 29th birthday began with 42 green confirmation marks on my phone. I stood in my kitchen at 5:12 in the morning, dressed for the drive to the Blue Ridge Mountains, checking the final weekend reassignments one last time. Each green mark meant a caregiver had accepted a visit. Mrs. Whitman's Saturday shower and Sunday breakfast were covered. Mr. Dawson's medication reminders were covered. The overnight rotation in Asheville had 2 backups. At Ellison Home Support, nothing became final until a branch scheduler reconciled the weekend queue. That would happen Monday. But the people had been assigned. The caregivers had answered. No elderly client was waiting for help I had forgotten to arrange. My phone chimed again. "Chloe. Mom says if you bring that phone into the lodge, she's throwing it off the mountain." Birthday rules. I almost smiled. Chloe had a way of turning a threat into something that looked playful enough to deny later. Me. Coverage is confirmed. Leaving now. I took a screenshot of the completed list, more from habit than suspicion. Then slipped the phone into my coat pocket beside a small notebook. I had started at the family company when I was 18, answering weekend calls while taking operations classes at night. 11 years later, I was still the person everyone contacted when a promise exceeded the staff available to keep it. My mother called that reliability, my gift. Chloe called it being too negative whenever I said no to one of her expansion ideas. The lodge sat beyond a line of bare trees, quiet in the winter low season. Dad met me outside before I had fully closed my car door. "There's the birthday girl," he said, reaching past me for the rectangular box on the passenger seat. "Careful," I said. "It's glass." The night shift caregivers had given me the Crystal Award the day before. Etched across the front were the words, "For keeping every promise when no one was watching." Dad turned the box over in his hands. "Your mother will like this. It isn't for Mom." He gave me the patient smile he used before board meetings. "I know, Mara. I meant she'll like seeing you appreciated." Inside, Mom had arranged a white cake, 4 coffee cups, and a vase of grocery store roses on the dining table. Chloe stood by the window in a cream sweater that looked chosen for photographs. She hugged me with one arm, careful not to wrinkle herself. 29, she said. "Almost respectable." "You're 26. "Exactly. I still have time." Mom laughed too loudly. Dad set the crystal box beside the cake. "Open it," Mom said. "I already did yesterday." "For the picture, Mara." Dad lifted the award while Chloe took several photos. From the angle she chose, the engraving faced away from the camera. Dad's hand remained around the base. "A gift from the whole Ellison team," he said. I looked at him. "The caregivers bought it themselves." His smile held. "That's what I mean. The team." My grandmother Ruth appeared on a video call propped against the sugar bowl. At 76, she rarely came to the mountains without her driver caregiver. but her voice still carried the authority of someone whose photograph had appeared in Ellison brochures for years. "Stand closer to Chloe," she instructed. "People always leave too much space in family pictures." I moved half a step. Chloe did not. Mom cut the cake before I blew out the candle. That should have warned me the celebration had already served its purpose. Chloe waited until Dad poured the coffee. Then she placed a navy folder beside my plate. "Just some continuity paperwork," she said. "I did not touch it. On my birthday. That's why we brought you somewhere private." Dad sat across from me. Mom stayed standing behind Chloe's chair. Ruth's face remained on the tablet screen. I opened the folder. The first page was a resignation letter. The second was a statement accepting responsibility for 42 uncovered visits. Beneath it sat an internal announcement naming Chloe interim chief executive, effective Monday morning. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the lodge heater clicking behind the wall. "What is this?" I asked. "A transition," Dad said. "You've been under too much pressure. Those visits aren't uncovered." I turned the second page toward him. "I reassigned them last night." Chloe stirred her coffee. "The dashboard says otherwise." I ran my finger down the list. Mrs. Whitman appeared twice. So did Mr. Dawson. Next to each name was the status open. "The weekend queue hasn't been reconciled," I said. "You can't call these abandoned before Monday." "There you go," Chloe said softly, making everything sound more complicated than it is. "A caregiver accepted each one, then the branches will find them." I already found them. Mom rested both hands on the back of Chloe's chair. "Why do you always have to make your sister look unprepared?" The question landed harder than the accusation. She had not asked whether the visits were covered. She had not even looked at the list. "Because she is asking me to sign a lie." Ruth leaned toward her screen. "Sign now and correct the details later. The company needs calm. The company needs accurate schedules." "Chloe needs this chance," Ruth replied. "You have always been able to make another one." I looked from Ruth's face to Dad's hands, folded over the folder, and then to the announcement beside Chloe's cup. Her new title was not described as temporary in the public paragraph. It called her a visionary next-generation leader. My name appeared once, in the sentence about failure. "Did the board approve this?" I asked. Dad's eyes dropped to the table. "We discussed contingencies." "When?" "This isn't an interrogation," Mom snapped. I picked up the first page and photographed it with my phone. Chloe reached across the table. "You can't take company documents." I pulled the page back. "You handed it to me and asked for my signature." "I'm keeping a record of what I was asked to sign." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The old reflex was already pressing against my ribs. Fix the schedule, protect the clients, calm Mom, make Chloe's announcement workable, earn my place back before I had technically lost it. I closed the folder instead. "I won't sign anything today. On Monday, I'll review every visit with the branch schedulers. Then I'll tell the board exactly what was covered and why this expansion plan is unsafe." Chloe's spoon struck the side of her cup. Mom's face changed. Not dramatically. Her mouth flattened, and the softness she had worn for the birthday pictures disappeared. "Fine," she said. "We'll take the family photo before you ruin the entire morning." The private overlook was reached by a narrow path behind the cabins. Pale sunlight cut through the trees, but the stones remained damp from the night. The lodge's only exterior camera faced the reception parking area on the other side of the building. There was no public turnout, no row of tourists, only the wind and the distant sound of people somewhere on a lower trail. Dad carried the crystal box under one arm. Chloe walked ahead with her phone ready. Mom positioned me near the low stone boundary. "Stand beside your sister," she said. "I'm leaving. You will smile for one photograph." "No, I'm going back to town, and I'm sending the board my coverage confirmations." Chloe lowered her phone. "If you do that, every frightened client call will be yours." "They already are. That's the problem." I turned toward the path. Mom stepped in front of me. "You cannot let her have one thing." "This isn't a birthday gift, Mom. It's my job and 42 clients. It was supposed to be simple." Her voice shook now. "You sign. Chloe leads. You help until things settle. So she gets the title, and I keep doing the work." You always find coverage. For most of my life, those words had sounded like praise. On that ledge, they sounded like a sentence. Not anymore, I said. Mom moved closer. Her palms struck between my shoulder blades. The stone disappeared beneath my right foot. I wish you'd never been born, she screamed behind me. I reached backward and caught only air. In the fractured second before I dropped below the ledge, I saw Dad lunge forward and seize the crystal box as it slipped from under his arm. He caught the gift. Chloe stood behind him. Her lips curved in an expression I read, in that instant, as relief. Then there was Sky, a hard burst of pain, and nothing I could arrange into a complete memory. I came back to the sound of my own breathing. The rhythm was wrong, short, panicked pulls that made the world tilt. In for 4, out for 6. I had taught that count to caregivers handling frightened clients. I used it now because it was the only instruction my mind could hold. I called for help between breaths. Someone on the lower trail answered. Emergency crews reached the ledge and brought me up. As the ambulance doors were closing, I heard Chloe tell a ranger. She was emotional about losing her job. I tried to lift my head, but the world folded inward again. When I woke after surgery, my left leg was elevated and wrapped from foot to knee. A nurse explained the fractures, the concussion, and the repair to my ankle in short pieces because I kept losing the middle of her sentences. An investigator came later with a small recorder resting on the table between us. Tell me only what you remember, she said. If there's a gap, say there's a gap. So I did. I told her about the folder. Mom blocking the path, the words she screamed, and the pressure against my back. I did not tell her Chloe had known what would happen. I did not know that. I said I saw Chloe smile. I also said the memory came from the instant before my head struck something below. The investigator told me the hiker had heard my calls but had not seen the overlook. The lodge camera showed our cars arriving and the ambulance leaving, but the path was outside its view. Your family says you stepped backward during an argument, she said. My mother pushed me. She held my gaze. I'm recording both statements. It was not the promise of justice. It was a record. At that moment, a record was more than my family wanted me to have. Mom arrived that afternoon, after the nurse asked whether I would allow the visit. I said yes, because some part of me still expected her to look at the metal frame around my ankle and become my mother again. She entered, crying. You pulled away from me, she said before she reached the bed. I tried to stop you. You said you wished I had never been born. People say terrible things when they're frightened. Dad came in behind her carrying the crystal box. A corner of the cardboard was dented. The award inside was intact. I saved it, he said, setting it on the windowsill. I stared at him. You saved the glass. His jaw tightened. I was trying to keep it from shattering and hurting someone else. Chloe entered last. She did not approach the bed. We need your work phone, she said. Clients are frightened. It's my assigned device. The company owns it. Then, send a written request. She folded her arms. You changed the passcode last week. I had changed it after a routine security prompt. I had not told Chloe. How do you know that? I asked. She glanced at Dad. It mentioned it. Maybe they had. Maybe she had tried to open it. With my head throbbing, I could not turn suspicion into fact, so I stored the question instead of the accusation. Dad pulled a chair closer. We'll cover your medical bills, he said. Every cent. Let the company handle public communication, and we can keep this from becoming uglier. What public communication? He paused. Mom stopped crying. Alan, she warned. Dad rubbed his thumb along the chair arm. The announcement cannot be pulled now. I had never asked him to pull an announcement. Leave, I said. Mom's face hardened. You don't mean that. I pressed the nurse call button. I do. After staff escorted them out, I asked the charge nurse to remove my parents and Chloe from the visitor list. I revoked permission for staff to discuss my condition with them. The forms shook in my hands badly enough that the nurse offered to write for me. I need to sign it myself, I said. That night was the first I spent without a family member available to help me, and the first night no one in my family could enter without my permission. By the 6th day, a therapist was teaching me how to transfer into a wheelchair. The rubber grip of the bed rail pressed into my palm. Clean laundry and antiseptic scented the room. My phone rested on speaker because holding it made my wrist tremble. Grace Whitman's voice came through thin and frightened. She read the public notice exactly as written. I had voluntarily stepped down following a failure to secure 42 scheduled visits. Chloe had been appointed chief executive effective Monday morning. What time was it posted? I asked. Monday at 7. Screenshot the full page, including the time. Don't forward it through Ellison's portal. Save it to your own device. The therapist touched my clenched hand. Mara, release the rail. I looked down. My knuckles had gone white. Sorry. I loosened one finger at a time. Grace checked her mother's portal while I waited. Both visits on the 42-item list showed completed care notes and caregiver confirmation times from before my birthday trip. Send only the records you're authorized to access, I told her. Your mother's, nothing else. The nurse arrived with my pain medication. I asked for 10 minutes not because I wanted to prove I was strong, but because the medication blurred the edges of time, and I needed the wording clear. In my notebook, I made 4 columns: coverage sent, lodge arrival, fall, announcement. Under the first, I wrote the time of my final caregiver confirmation. Under the last, I wrote Monday, 7 a.m. Then I called Denise Harper, the scheduler who managed the communications queue. She did not answer. I left no accusation, only a request that she preserve the records used to produce the 42 visit count. I sent the same request by email, along with a demand for my personnel file, any resignation bearing my name, and the documents supporting the public notice. For 3 hours, there was nothing. Then Denise sent 7 words. Do not trust the version they send. Before I could answer, Mom called from a number I had not blocked. Ruth's church friends are asking questions, she said. Tell the investigator you were confused. I wasn't confused about your hand on my back. You have a concussion, which is why I described only what I remember. Her voice dropped. Do not destroy this family because you are angry about Chloe's promotion. I'm ending this call. Mara. I disconnected. Chloe's message arrived less than a minute later with a PDF attached. Since you're refusing to be reasonable, here is the resignation for your convenience. Sign electronically, and we can stop the rumors. I did not call her. I wrote one response and copied the company's general board address. I have not resigned. I do not authorize any person to represent that I resigned, to use my name on a resignation, or to access my devices or medical information. All further communication must be in writing. My thumb hovered over send. If I pressed it, Dad might withdraw the offer to pay my medical bills. Mom would not help with discharge. Ruth's care calls would keep coming, and for the first time in years, I would not be the person solving them. I pressed send. The hospital's social worker helped me set a password for anyone requesting information and confirmed that my family had no authority to make decisions for me. Then I blocked their direct numbers for the remainder of rehabilitation. The personnel packet arrived electronically just before evening medication. I opened it, expecting altered schedules or a carefully worded explanation. Instead, the first page was the resignation from the lodge. There was no signature at the bottom. Behind it was a board acceptance page stating that my voluntary transition had been approved. I checked the date twice because the concussion made numbers slide when I was tired. Then, I compared it with the date in my notebook. The board had accepted my resignation on Friday morning. My birthday was Saturday. They had accepted a resignation I had not signed before. I had refused to sign it before my mother pushed me, before the company accused me of abandoning anyone, and before there was an accident to blame. That date did not leave room for the explanation my parents kept offering. They had not reacted to my fall. They had prepared for my absence. 3 weeks after leaving rehabilitation, I moved into a furnished apartment with wide doorways, a roll-in shower, and rent high enough to make every hospital envelope feel heavier. My right ankle remained locked in a brace. Crossing the living room with a walker took longer than driving between 2 Ellison branches once had. Rain made the repaired joint ache deep under the metal, and concentration still came in short stretches. A yellow timer on the kitchen counter reminded me to rest before dizziness made the decision for me. Depending on those small rules embarrassed me until I remembered where ignoring limits had taken me before. Dad requested a meeting by email. I agreed to see him in the building's ground floor lounge, where the front desk could see us, and told him no one else could come. He arrived carrying a blue folder. "Your mother wanted to be here," he said. "She isn't allowed in my apartment. Mara, she's still your mother. And this is still my address." He set the folder between us. The agreement inside promised to cover my medical expenses, continue my salary for 6 months, and offer me an advisory position after recovery. In exchange, I had to describe the fall as accidental, accept my resignation, and refrain from discussing Ellison's staffing decisions. The phrase on the second page stopped me. Voluntary transition for continuity. It was the same wording printed on the board acceptance dated before my birthday. Dad placed his phone on speaker. Mom's voice entered the lounge before I could object. "This is a chance for all of us to heal," she said. "Healing doesn't require a non-disclosure clause." Chloe spoke next, close to the phone. "Clients are already suffering because you're being stubborn. Name one." No one answered. Dad tapped the paragraph about medical bills. "You need help. Let us give it without turning everything into a fight." My first payment plan was due in 9 days. Bathing still required a bench. Groceries had to be delivered. Refusing the money would not make me brave. It would make the next several months frighteningly expensive. But the offer was not help. It was the purchase price of my version of events. I closed the folder. "No. At least keep it," Dad said. "You'll feel differently when the bills arrive." He left it on the table and walked out. Back upstairs, I photographed every page, saved copies in 2 password-protected locations, and examined the footer. In small gray type beneath the final paragraph were the words, "Requesting author, Chloe Ellison." My sister had not merely benefited from the agreement. She had requested the terms of my silence. The next morning, I called the hospital billing office and arranged monthly payments I could barely manage. Then I reduced the hours of the aide who helped with laundry and bathing, keeping only the tasks I could not perform safely. Independence, I discovered, was not a clean declaration. It was choosing which hardship belonged to me and which price I would not pay. The bills did arrive. So did a trade article praising Chloe's bold 3-branch growth vision. The projected first-year revenue looked familiar enough that I wheeled to my desk and opened a PDF Dad had sent to my personal email months earlier, so I could prepare a board presentation from home. The number came from Scenario B in my capacity model. My model was not a promise. It was a boundary. Scenario B worked only if caregiver turnover stayed below 22%, training happened in stages, and growth remained under 10% each quarter. Those conditions appeared in a red footer on every page because removing them turned a careful forecast into wishful arithmetic. Chloe's published graphic kept the revenue and removed the red footer. On paper, that omission looked like 3 missing lines. In a client's home, it meant an older woman could wait all morning for help getting out of bed because the new contract had been sold before a trained caregiver existed to serve it. The old reflex told me to call Chloe, rebuild the roster, and prevent the failure myself. Instead, I wrote to the board. The message identified the exact page, explained that the public projection did not represent my professional recommendation, and attached the version already in my lawful possession. No threats. No claim that I owned company work. Just the assumptions they had erased and the likely result. Before sending it, I read each sentence aloud. Anger would let them dismiss me as unstable. Accuracy would force them either to check the numbers or knowingly ignore them. My finger rested over the trackpad while I pictured the clients whose names would eventually fill those new contracts. Then I sent the warning and added it to the record folder. Dad replied with 1 sentence. The board has updated the assumptions. He did not say turnover had fallen. He did not say training capacity had increased. He did not say the staff existed. 2 days later, Denise agreed to meet me at a cafe near my physical therapy clinic. She chose a back table and kept both hands around a coffee she never drank. Before we began, I placed my phone on the table. "May I record this?" Her eyes moved toward the entrance. "For your notes only. I can't promise where truthful evidence may need to go. If you don't consent, I'll take written notes. After a long pause, she nodded. Record it. Denise said Chloe had called late Friday afternoon and ordered the executive staffing snapshot closed several hours early. Normally, branch schedulers continued matching replies through the weekend, then reconciled the queue on Monday. My 42 accepted reassignments arrived after the artificial cutoff. But I saw them, Denise said. The caregivers had accepted. Then how did the dashboard show them as open? Her thumb pressed into the paper cup. I moved the later updates into pending audit. That status did not delete the confirmations. It hid them from the frozen executive view. Branch staff could still complete the visits, but the summary Chloe showed the board counted those same visits as uncovered. 42 people had not been abandoned. 42 confirmations had been placed outside the window used to accuse me. You created the number, I said. Chloe told me it was a temporary snapshot. You knew the visits were staffed. Denise looked down. Yes. From her bag, she removed a folded queue summary. Her user identification appeared beside the status changes. On another line, Chloe was listed as requester for the resignation announcement and Dad as approver. They ordered old drafts cleared after you fell, Denise said. I printed this before I deleted mine. The announcement had been scheduled for 7 Monday morning, hours before I was expected back from the lodge. Its text already called the frozen Friday count a final failure. Then Denise told me about the $12,000 retention bonus she had accepted after my fall. For a moment, the printout in her hand looked less like help and more like insurance she had kept for herself. Why tell me now? I asked. Because they're saying I chose the cutoff. That answer mattered. Denise was not there only because the truth troubled her. She was also afraid of becoming the next useful person Ellison discarded. No promise of forgiveness came from me. No promise to protect her from consequences either. I scanned every page, recorded where it came from, and handed the original back. If you speak again, I said, the bonus is part of the account. All of it, or none of it. Her shoulders lowered. Understood. At home, the recording went into the same protected folder as the scan. A second copy went to a separate account, along with a note stating when and where Denise had given it to me. If my phone disappeared or the company challenged the pages, the evidence would not depend on a single device or on Denise continuing to be brave. The printout explained the false picture. It did not authenticate the status history of every visit, and it proved nothing about Mom's hand on my back. Still, it gave me something stronger than a suspicion. A method, a timeline, and names attached to both. Grandmother Ruth came the following week. Her driver-caregiver carried a casserole into my kitchen, confirmed he would wait in the car, and reminded her that they needed to leave before dark. At 76, Ruth moved slowly with a polished cane, but the framed photographs of her opening Ellison's first office still made employees straighten when she entered a room. She inspected my walker before looking at me. Judith says you're improving. Judith doesn't receive my medical information. Ruth settled into the armchair. Your mother made a terrible mistake. It was the closest anyone related to me had come to acknowledging the overlook. Which mistake? I asked. Her mouth tightened. Don't make the worst moment define everyone. Then she explained that senior staff still listened to her, clients trusted her name, and the continuity testimonial she had signed was meant to reassure them. If I quietly repaired the schedule for 3 months, she believed the company could correct the announcement later. My phone rang. Judith's name appeared on the screen. Ruth reached toward it. Answer. She knows I'm here. No. I declined the call and turned the phone face down. Mara, this can end. You haven't asked whether she pushed me. Ruth looked toward the kitchen, where the untouched casserole sat cooling. I believe you were hurt. Not that Mom had hurt me. Only that I had been hurt. When Ruth began listing problems with her own care schedule, my mind automatically started arranging names and hours. The solution formed before I could stop it. I wrote down the number of an independent care coordinator instead. She can review your coverage, I said. I won't manage it. Ruth stared at the card. Chloe needs this chance. You have always been able to make another one. There it was again, the compliment that turned my endurance into permission. Chloe could receive the opportunity because everyone assumed I could rebuild whatever they took. Then let me make it, I said. Somewhere else. Grace gave me the first place to try. A small independent care agency had lost 2 weekend caregivers to illness and needed help protecting 10 client visits. Its owner could pay for a few hours of planning, not another full-time manager. My body wanted rest. My bank account wanted the work. Every old habit wanted me to take the emergency phone and carry the weekend alone. Grace arranged the introduction and then stepped back. They need your judgment, she told me, not another person to exhaust. Talia, a senior caregiver I trusted, reviewed the draft rotation from my dining table after her shift. She pointed to the line, where I had written my own number, as the final backup. What happens when your therapy starts? She asked. The scheduler calls me afterward. And if 2 people cancel during therapy? I step out. Talia held my gaze. Then you haven't built coverage. You've renamed yourself. The words stung because they were true. So I started again. The revised plan paired each visit with a primary caregiver and a paid backup who had already agreed to the time. No one exceeded safe hours. The agency scheduler received 1 escalation list, 1 decision tree, and the authority to act without asking the owner for every change. Instead of being available forever, I scheduled a single training session and 2 brief check-ins. We worked at my dining table with colored cards spread between my medication bottles. Red meant a visit that could not move because it involved medication or getting someone safely out of bed. Yellow meant a time window could shift if the client agreed. Blue showed caregivers trained for that person's needs. Each time the scheduler tried to solve a gap by giving the strongest worker another shift, I made her calculate what that worker's next morning would look like. By the end, the schedule was not flawless. It was honest. Every promise had a trained person, a backup, and a limit. On Saturday morning, the first cancellation arrived. The scheduler used the backup list before calling me. Mrs. Alvarez received help with breakfast and medication on time. Mr. Pritchard's bathing visit started 20 minutes late instead of disappearing from the day. My hands stayed away from the phone until the agreed check-in. That felt less heroic than rescuing the entire schedule. It also worked better. On Monday, I trained the scheduler to rebuild the rotation herself. She asked questions, changed 2 assumptions, and completed the next weekend without borrowing my judgment. The agency owner watched the final practice round, then slid an invoice template toward me. What business name should accounting use? She asked. The blank line waited. For 11 years, every useful thing I knew had appeared beneath the Ellison name. Charging for that knowledge felt dangerously close to admitting care had a price. But unpaid devotion had never made my work purer. It had only made it easier to take. I typed Havenline continuity. The owner paid the invoice and asked, "Would you consider redesigning the rest of our scheduling system?" The amount in my account would not cover a month of treatment. It was not rescue money. It was proof that my skill could leave the building my parents owned and still have value. A narrow professional review concluded several weeks later. The reviewer had my pre-trip messages, Grace's authorized records, the normal Monday reconciliation schedule, and Denise's Q summary. Her letter said there was insufficient basis to claim I had abandoned clients and that confirmed reassignments had been excluded from the executive view. It did not verify every one of the 42 visits. It did not decide who pushed me. It did not order Ellison to restore my title. Still, the accusation could no longer stand as an uncontested fact. Grace called after reading the finding. Does this mean they have to tell everyone they lied? No, I said. The answer tasted smaller than the truth we had proved. It means they can't support what they said about me. The rest will depend on what they do next and what I build next. Ellison responded with a public statement, saying no client had experienced lasting harm. In private, Dad offered me a confidential return as an advisor, with no authority over hiring, contracts, or staffing limits. I declined in writing. My own public response contained 2 sentences. I did not resign from Ellison Home Support. I will not return without transparent authority and accountability for the decisions made in my name. That evening, Chloe appeared in an online business interview, announcing 3 new expansion contracts. She stood beside a projection chart bearing the exact first-year revenue line from Scenario B. I enlarged the image until the numbers filled my screen. The bottom margin was clean. The red warning footer was gone. Ellison had not escaped my prediction. Chloe had erased the conditions that made it possible. 18 months later, I walked into Havenline's first office with a cane in one hand, and Chloe's missing warning footer still stored in 3 different places. The office occupied 4 rooms above a pharmacy. Rain ticked against the windows, tightening my repaired ankle and hip before the prospective client arrived. 2 schedulers shared the room beside mine. Talia, who still worked at Ellison but occasionally helped me train caregivers on her days off, had arranged chairs around the conference table. Havenline was no empire. Most of our income came from continuity plans, scheduler training, and temporary help for small agencies in trouble. Every month ended above water, but never by much. The client representative wanted coverage for a large group of older adults spread across 3 counties. Halfway through my presentation, the familiar pressure gathered behind my eyes. Rapid transitions still became difficult when fatigue set in, so I sat down, opened my written sequence, and continued without pretending the pause had not happened. Our dashboard showed projected revenue beside caregiver hours, training status, missed breaks, and turnover. If strain rose, capacity fell. Nothing appeared without the conditions required to support it. "Your plan is more cautious than Ellison's," the representative said. "It is more measurable. Ellison says it can begin with twice this volume." The room seemed to narrow around that sentence. "Do they already have the trained staff?" I asked. "They say hiring is underway." "Then they are counting people they hope to employ." "I am counting people qualified and available now." The representative turned to the page showing our service limits. "What happens when 2 caregivers call out on the same morning?" "The paid reserve takes the first visit. A cross-trained supervisor takes the second. If both are unavailable, we stop accepting new visits until coverage returns." "You would turn away revenue?" "I would turn away a promise we could not keep." Outside the conference room, one of my schedulers was confirming a bathing visit for a man whose daughter lived several states away. Capacity was not a number to impress a committee. It was whether that daughter could go to work without wondering if her father had been left in bed. Winning the full contract would have paid for a larger office and another scheduler. All I had to do was increase the number on the final page. I left it unchanged. The representative declined the full proposal but offered Havenline a limited pilot in 1 county. Slower growth hurt. A promise I could keep was still worth more than one that merely looked ambitious. After the meeting, Talia remained beside the rain-streaked window. "Twice your capacity," she said. "That explains last week." She returned 3 days later with a resignation letter and a small folder containing only her own schedules, pay records, and emails. Ellison had assigned her repeated double shifts while describing each one as a temporary emergency. 2 former caregivers applied to Havenline separately that month and brought similar records. Each had been told the branches would find coverage after new contracts started. "Chloe says the hiring numbers are strong," Talia told me. "Applications are not hiring numbers." "They are now. Anyone who attends orientation appears in the expansion presentation as available staff. Some never complete training, others never accept a shift." That was how Ellison had promised twice Havenline's capacity. Chloe was counting interest as labor and hoping exhausted workers would fill the difference. Before accepting any application, I created a written rule. Havenline would not request Ellison's client lists, staffing lists, rates, or private records. No employee could solicit coworkers while on Ellison time. Every applicant had to state how the contact began and provide only records she had the right to possess. Talia signed the disclosure, showing she had approached me. Her resignation email documented the double shifts and Ellison's refusal to set an end date. Only then did I offer her a position. Her Havenline schedule included protected days off and a written ceiling on weekly hours. Accepting those conditions meant I could not use her as the instant answer to every difficult weekend. The other applicants received the same rule. When one offered to send me Ellison's full roster, I stopped the conversation and documented the refusal. Beating Chloe by copying her methods would only build another place where exhausted people carried someone else's ambition. Havenline had to survive without becoming that. As she closed the folder, she hesitated. "There's something else you should see." Her phone showed a photograph taken in Ellison's public lobby. My Crystal Birthday Award stood inside a glass case. The caregiver's engraving remained visible, but a new metal plaque beneath it read, "Presented to the Ellison Leadership Team for Excellence in Continuity." Dad had saved the glass. Chloe had saved the credit. Denise contacted me the following month from a personal address. Her message contained no greeting, only a request to meet and a scan of her separation notice. Ellison had blamed her for rising turnover and dismissed her for failure to maintain reporting integrity. That was Denise's account. The notice confirmed the termination date and the stated reason. Nothing more. She came to Havenline, carrying a document box. Talia brought us coffee, then closed the office door and returned to work. Denise watched her leave. "She got out in time," Denise said. "This meeting is about what you brought." Inside the box were the original communications queue printout, the status change summary generated on the Friday before my birthday, Denise's retention bonus letter, and a paper calendar. On the Thursday square, 2 days before the trip, she had written, "Chloe, prepare Mara resignation announcement. Contingency. I want you to say I was another victim," Denise said. "They used me too. You followed the instruction because I thought I would lose my job. Then you accepted $12,000 and stayed quiet." Her mouth opened, then closed. "I will say what the records establish," I continued. "You supplied them. You disclosed the bonus. You also changed the statuses while knowing the caregivers had accepted. I won't erase your choices to make your cooperation easier." Denise pushed the box toward me anyway. This time, photographs and a recorded explanation were not enough. I compared the document codes with the personnel packet sent to me after the hospital. The codes matched, but that could still be challenged. At my expense, an independent records examiner reviewed the original files and the paper printouts. She confirmed when the files had been created, when the announcement had been scheduled, and that the copies had not been altered after those dates. She could verify the records, not Denise's intentions, and not what happened at the Overlook. The verified sequence covered less than a page. Thursday. The resignation announcement was drafted. Friday morning. Dad approved the board acceptance for my voluntary transition. Friday afternoon. Chloe requested the early staffing freeze. Denise moved 42 accepted reassignments into pending audit, placing them outside the executive view. Monday at 7 in the morning. The announcement was scheduled to publish. A separate presentation named Chloe Interim Chief Executive beginning that same Monday. The accusation had not caused their decision. They had manufactured the accusation to support a decision already made. I placed the verified pages in order across the conference table and compared them with the photograph of the unsigned resignation. The dates aligned without requiring Denise's memory to fill a gap. Her calendar supported the sequence, but the company identifiers and scheduling records carried it. What remained beyond my reach was Ellison's complete internal history for every confirmation. I could prove the frozen view had been manipulated and the removal planned. I could not honestly claim more. That limit frustrated me. It also protected the truth from becoming as careless as the accusation used against me. "They did not remove me because I fell," I said. "They needed a reason for the removal they had already written." Denise looked toward the documents. "I should have stopped it." Yes. No argument followed. Near Chloe's name on the presentation was a note I had missed during the first reading. 4 words sat inside a narrow comment box: "Mara to stabilize first 90 days. Even after removing my title, they had expected me to protect Chloe from the result. Dad requested another meeting as soon as my private notice to the board listed the verified dates. I allowed him and Chloe into Havenline's conference room during business hours. Mom joined through Dad's phone. Chloe placed a consulting proposal in front of me. The fee was large enough to fund Havenline's pilot for almost a year. "This proves we want to repair things," she said. "You would oversee staffing while I keep the expansion moving." The contract made me responsible for coverage, but gave me no authority over sales promises, budgets, hiring deadlines, or new admissions. If Chloe sold care Havenline could not staff, my name would appear beside the failure again. The fee could have paid for 2 schedulers, months of office rent, and every rehabilitation appointment I had postponed to protect cash flow. Dad had chosen the amount well. It was large enough to make refusal look emotional and acceptance look responsible. I turned to the page, defining my authority. The space beneath that heading contained only an obligation to advise. Pause intake until the workforce matches the contracts, I said. That would damage our launch. Give me authority to cap new visits and protect rest hours. Dad leaned forward. We are offering you a generous path back. You are offering to rent my accountability while keeping my judgment outside the room. Mom's voice came through the phone. Must everything become an accusation? The dates aren't accusations. Dad changed direction. He tapped the capacity chart attached to the proposal. This spreadsheet was created at Ellison. It belongs to the company. The bait was obvious. If I fought over ownership, they could turn the meeting into an argument about stolen work. Ellison can keep the spreadsheet, I said. It cannot own my future work, my judgment, or my willingness to apply either one. Chloe crossed her arms. You are not the only person who can read a schedule. No, I'm the only person in this room willing to believe what it says. One alternative remained on the table. An independently supervised transition plan, authority to limit new visits, and written protection for caregiver hours. Chloe refused to delay any contract. Dad called outside supervision insulting, so I rejected the fee and ended the meeting. The money would have made Havenline safer. Taking it would have made every unsafe promise mine to repair. Ruth tested that boundary less than a week later. Chloe had promised to visit while Ruth's regular coordinator was away, then canceled by text that morning. Ruth was not in danger. Her day caregiver was present, but several appointments for the following week had not been confirmed. My hand reached for the old scheduling notebook before I caught myself. Instead, I arranged for the independent coordinator whose number I had given Ruth months earlier to call her. Then I visited Ruth's home after the coordinator had taken over. Her day caregiver let me in and remained within call in the next room. Ruth sat beneath a framed photograph of herself and Chloe at an Ellison anniversary dinner. You could have handled those calls in half the time, she said. That is why everyone keeps expecting me to handle them. On the table lay the testimonial Ellison had used after my fall. The records produced during my professional review included its approval chain. Ruth had reviewed the wording twice. In the first version, both granddaughters were named. Her final email requested one change: remove Mara. Keep focus on Chloe's continuity. You told me you signed this only to reassure clients, I said. That was true. You also asked them to remove my name. Ruth adjusted the blanket across her knees. The message needed to be clear. Clear about what? Her answer came without anger. Chloe should inherit an Ellison company. You were always capable of building something else. For years, I had treated Ruth as the person trapped between dependence and loyalty. Her appointments, medications, and care gaps had become my reason for answering every call. Even after the overlook, some part of me had believed she was waiting for enough proof to choose me. She had already chosen. Strength had never earned me equal regard. It had only made sacrificing me appear practical. Memories rearranged themselves around Ruth's answer. The holiday calls asking me to repair Chloe's mistakes, the praise whenever I gave up a weekend, the testimony signed while I was learning to walk again. None of that required guessing what Ruth felt. Her revisions, her signature, and the sentence she had just spoken were enough. For one dangerous moment, proving I could still manage everything seemed easier than accepting that she had never intended to choose differently. The notebook in my bag could have solved her appointments before dinner. Leaving it closed cost more than the work would have. I'll make sure you have the names of qualified coordinators, I said. I will not schedule your care, pay the bills, negotiate the rates, or correct Chloe's promises. You would leave your grandmother to strangers? I am leaving your care with professionals you choose. That is not abandonment. Ruth studied me as if searching for the old opening. Then she asked, will Havenline at least give Ellison a discounted subcontract? She did not ask me to stay. Our pilot renewed at the end of that year, with every visit staffed and turnover low enough that the client expanded the agreement. Havenline won a multi-year regional contract using verified results rather than promises. Growth came in steps. The first licensed branch opened only after the pilot renewed. A second followed after a full year of positive cash flow. The third waited, until Talia and two schedulers could run daily operations without me. One marketing consultant suggested calling me the Ellison daughter who built a better system. I removed the phrase. Havenline would not live beneath their name, even in opposition. Talia became head of operations. Every Wednesday evening, she held the emergency phone while I went to rehabilitation and then home. By the fourth year, home meant a small house outside my parents' neighborhood, with a porch rail I had chosen for myself and one evening each week when no company file or evidence folder crossed the kitchen table. The first evening I protected felt almost empty. No ringing phone told me where to direct my attention. I reheated soup, completed the exercises for my ankle, and sat on the porch until the ache eased. Nothing collapsed because I was unavailable. The next morning, Talia reported that two problems had arisen, and both had been handled by the systems we had built. Profit returned to training and measured expansion, but my salary covered treatment, rest, and a life that did not require me to collapse before it counted as necessary. At the end of that fourth year, a public release announced that Ellison had signed the first of its 3 major expansion contracts. Less than an hour later, Chloe called. "Give me the staffing formula by Friday," she said, "or the missed visits will be on you." On my screen, Havenline's verified capacity sat beside actual trained caregivers and protected rest hours. No imaginary workers, no deleted limits. The formula was never the problem, I said. You removed the conditions. Mara, people will suffer. Then stop admitting clients you cannot serve. I ended the call. The missed visits would belong to the people who had promised them. For the first time, I let that truth stand without placing myself beneath it. The missed visits belonged to the people who had promised them. By the beginning of the 6th year, however, the people paying for those promises were Ellison's caregivers and clients. Havenline had 4 branches and about 110 caregivers. The 4th branch had opened with retained cash only after the 3rd could operate for months without my daily intervention. That discipline mattered when Grace called. "Mom has had 4 caregivers in 2 weeks," she said. Yesterday's woman was kind, but she had never seen the transfer equipment. "Can Havenline take us?" The old part of me wanted to say yes before she finished asking. Instead, our scheduling team checked training, travel time, backup coverage, and the hours already accepted by the branch. We had room for Grace's mother without pushing another client aside. Only then did I approve the transfer. The intake scheduler called Grace back while I remained at the table. She explained who would arrive first, who was trained on the transfer equipment, and which caregiver would cover if the primary worker became unavailable. Grace did not thank me for saving her. There had been no rescue. We had checked a real system and made one supportable commitment. Later that morning, a hospital coordinator asked Havenline to accept a large block of Ellison clients before discharge. "We can take 9 this week," I said. "The rest need staggered starts, or other providers. These people may go home without care. Then we should not give them start dates we cannot staff." The coordinator named 3 people whose relatives could not take more time away from work. Each name pressed against my refusal. Saying yes would ease that conversation today, then place unfamiliar or exhausted workers in their homes tomorrow. I offered stage start dates and the names of 2 other qualified providers for the clients we could not accept. Turning down the full block meant refusing revenue large enough to fill another office. It also meant my schedulers would not manufacture coverage by extending the same workers through another exhausted weekend. The continuity reports sent with the transfer requests showed Ellison's completed visits falling, while its contracted volume kept rising. Turnover had crossed 22%, the limit printed in red on Scenario B years earlier. One coordinator lowered her voice during a follow-up call. Their contract report lists orientation applicants as fully available staff. We cannot match several of the names to completed training. Chloe was still counting hoped-for workers as present ones. This time, the false capacity was no longer supporting a presentation. It was supporting discharge promises made to real people. The public response came before the next transfer did. Mom appeared in a local television interview beside an Ellison sign. The station posted the clip online, where I watched her accuse Havenline of exploiting frightened seniors to punish its own relatives. Dad sent a letter to extended relatives claiming I had destabilized Ellison by recruiting its staff. 2 employees forwarded copies to me after the accusation reached their parents. Ruth left a voicemail saying I had become the selfish daughter everyone once feared I would be. None of them asked how many clients Havenline could safely accept. Every message asked me to stop making Chloe look unsuccessful. By afternoon, staff members were showing one another angry comments. A prospective partner paused negotiations and requested reassurance that Havenline was not creating the crisis it claimed to manage. Talia came into my office with a draft response filling 3 pages. "Every statement in here is supported," she said. The draft named the early staffing freeze, the altered announcement, the relabeled award, and each warning Chloe had ignored. Publishing it would have felt honest. It also would have turned our workforce into spectators at an Ellison argument. I closed the document. "We release our numbers, not their behavior." Havenline published verified retention, workload limits, transition requirements, and the rule against soliciting employees from another provider. Every incoming worker had to document that she or he approached us independently. The statement named no relative and made no claim beyond records generated inside our own company. At the staff meeting before publication, one caregiver asked whether responding only with Havenline's data would look weak. "It may," I said. "But your schedules and your employment choices are not ammunition for my dispute. We show what we can prove about this workplace. We do not expose people to win an argument." Talia deleted the names from her original draft herself. The decision remained mine, but carrying it out became part of the standard we were defending. Some comments remained hostile. Our staff stopped wondering whether I would use them in a public fight. The prospective partner kept negotiations paused. "Your standards answer our concern about Havenline," its representative told me. "Only a full operational review of Ellison will settle the larger market concern." 2 days later, Chloe asked for a meeting. She arrived with Dad and a contract offering me 6 months as Ellison's chief continuity advisor. The compensation exceeded my Havenline salary, and the company would reimburse a transition team of my choosing. The amount could have paid down my remaining medical balance and added to Havenline's 4th branch reserve without taking another dollar from operations. For several seconds, the clean financial relief competed with the clauses beneath it. "You wanted authority," Chloe said. "This gives you a chief title." The title covered staffing recovery, final control over sales promises, staffing targets, budgets, and public communication remained with her. "If you sign another contract we cannot staff, can I reject it?" I asked. "You can advise me. Can I pause new visits when caregiver hours exceed safe limits?" "That decision stays with the executive team." Dad slid a second page toward me. "Chloe is also willing to remove the old abandonment notice from the company website. Will Ellison publish a correction through the same channels that received the accusation?" Chloe's expression tightened. "Privately removing it should be enough. Dragging the past into public view would damage client confidence." "The notice damaged my professional name in public," I said. "Private removal protects Ellison, not me." Their offer was generous only where generosity protected their control. My name could disappear from the lie quietly, while my work returned loudly enough to save the contracts. I placed my own bridge terms on the table: independent oversight, an immediate pause on new admissions, protected rest periods, accurate staffing reports, and written authority for me to reject contracts unsupported by trained caregivers. Chloe read the first page and stopped. "This is a hostile takeover. It is the authority required to carry the responsibility you are offering. You are using a difficult quarter to seize control. Then keep control and solve it without me." Dad asked whether I would reduce the oversight requirement. I withdrew the proposal instead. "The next offer will not be consulting," I told him. "It will be ownership or nothing." He did not laugh. "Could Havenline qualify for acquisition financing?" he asked. The answer depended on whether I was willing to risk the company I had built. Ellison breached service requirements and lending conditions within the next month. A formal notice opened a supervised recapitalization or sale. Heather Lynn, an acquisitions officer at a regional lender, confirmed that Havenline could submit a bid, but only after proving it could survive the purchase. The preliminary packet stripped away the 6-branch image. Only 4 branches had client levels close to viable. Fewer than 100 active trained caregivers remained. Receivables were shrinking while overtime costs, service credits, and debt payments increased. Contract renewals were in danger. At our first leadership meeting, I placed the notice on the table. We can preserve the viable service areas and protect the clients caught in the transition, I said. Talia did not open the packet. Are we buying a care company? She asked. Or, are you buying one more chance to make your parents choose you? The question struck the place I had kept out of every model. One branch leader worried Ellison's debt would consume Havenline's training budget. A scheduler asked whether our employees would be expected to absorb emergency shifts during integration. Another leader pointed out that our stable workplace could disappear beneath leases and promises we had not made. The questions kept coming. Would existing Havenline clients lose familiar caregivers during the transition? Would branch leaders inherit targets set under Chloe's contracts? Would I expect managers to stay late simply because the crisis belonged to people I knew? My first answers all began with some version of, "We will manage." The phrase sounded too much like "you always find coverage." Without asking, I had begun volunteering their labor to rescue people whose names activated my guilt. It was the same entitlement I had condemned when Dad told me I always found coverage. "We are not proceeding tonight," I said. The bid paused for 48 hours. During that time, I rebuilt it around conditions that protected Havenline. A fixed limit on assumed debt, no unpaid overtime, a separate transition reserve, continued authority for our leadership team, and the right to leave if the records were incomplete. Every condition answered a question raised in that room. Existing clients kept their assigned teams unless they consented to changes. Expansion stopped during integration. Branch leaders could reject targets unsupported by verified staffing. The reserve had to exist before the first Ellison schedule entered Havenline's system. Long screen sessions still triggered headaches and made figures blur. The data room schedule used bounded work periods with breaks between them. Talia took responsibility for ordinary operations while I reviewed the purchase. She did not interpret the evidence or make the bid decisions for me. Heather offered no special rate and no reassurance based on what had happened to me. The lender required conservative cash flow, evidence that Havenline could maintain payroll, and proof that the purchase would not depend on Ellison's discarded expansion forecast. "The loan is repaid by operations, not justice," she said. "If the combined company cannot carry it under cautious assumptions, there is no loan." That was exactly the answer I needed, even if it was not the one I wanted. When the revised protections were complete, the leadership team voted to proceed with due diligence. No one agreed out of loyalty to me. They agreed because the terms allowed Havenline to survive even if the acquisition did not. The first authorized contract files contained 3 warnings issued before Chloe signed the expansion agreements. Each warning stated that Ellison lacked enough trained caregivers for the promised volume. She had signed anyway. Winter air tightened my ankle on the morning I returned to Ellison's building as an authorized bidder. The cane clicked against the lobby floor. I did not hide it behind my coat or speed up to look untouched. The Crystal Birthday Award stood inside its glass case, beneath the replacement plaque crediting the leadership team. My pace slowed for one step, then continued toward the data room. Reclaiming the object before securing the workers would have repeated the priorities that put it in Dad's hands. Authorized records completed 2 chains. The scheduling source log showed that each of the 42 reassignments had been accepted by a caregiver before Denise moved those confirmations into pending audit. Her changes referenced Chloe's early freeze instruction and produced the exact executive snapshot used to accuse me. The green confirmations had always existed. They had simply been moved outside the view shown to the board. That record cleared the abandonment claim. It did not prove Mom pushed me, and I did not use it to claim otherwise. The operating files told the second story. My original model contained the turnover, training, and growth conditions in red. Chloe's expansion presentation copied the revenue line without them. After that came rising turnover, internal warnings, signed contracts, overtime costs, service credits, threatened renewals, and debt balances. Dad's approvals appeared beside the decisions that kept expansion moving. Each figure ended in a human consequence. Overtime records showed the same caregivers returning after too little rest. Service credits meant clients had paid for reliability they did not receive. Threatened renewals meant revenue could disappear before the loans did. When the headache behind my eyes sharpened, I closed the screen and took the scheduled break instead of proving I could continue. Talia answered an operations call in the hallway. The purchase analysis waited until I returned. No evidence became less true because I respected the limits of the body reading it. The company had not collapsed because I refused to rescue it. It had converted missing limits into promises, promises into exhausted workers, and failed service into debt. Current cash flow, not the number of signs outside branch offices, set the value. With Talia, Heather, and an independent transition accountant present, I built the purchase model. 4 service areas could remain if payroll, employee obligations, client continuity, training, and a transition reserve were funded before any shareholder payment. Those priorities lowered the price my parents would receive. They also kept Havenline from paying for growth that had never truly existed. The accountant reviewed the final page. A bailout loan delays the failure and leaves current management in place. A purchase can stabilize the viable operation, but not with the Ellisons retaining authority. The agenda for the next meeting described bridge financing and a possible licensing agreement. Dad opened by asking what interest rate Havenline would charge for a temporary loan. "I am not offering a loan," I said. The board representatives looked up as Talia distributed the purchase documents. Havenline offered to buy 100% of the operating company, preserve employee pay and benefits, assume verified client obligations, consolidate non-viable locations, and refinance the supportable portion of the debt. The valuation used present cash flow, fewer than 100 trained caregivers, likely contract retention, lease exit costs, service credits, and the transition reserve. Secured obligations and transition costs would be paid before any remaining equity reached the Ellison shareholders. Every Ellison relative would leave management for the minimum transition period. The company would also publish a correction, stating that I had not abandoned clients, that the 42 accepted reassignments had been excluded from the management view, and that the resignation announcement had been prepared before my birthday trip. Mom sat beside Chloe with both hands around a closed notebook. "So we sell you our company, and you throw us out of it?" she asked. "You sell an operating company that cannot refinance under its current structure. Havenline assumes the work and the supportable debt. Management control is not included for the sellers." Dad studied the page, showing what remained after secured obligations and transition costs. "This leaves the shareholders with a fraction of the old value. The old value depended on contracts the workforce cannot deliver." Chloe pushed the valuation pages away. "This is revenge. You are pricing 6 branches like a distressed regional agency. 4 service areas are supportable. 2 leases are liabilities. The company is worth what it was before the market turned against us." I looked at the workforce line rather than the old valuation. "How many trained caregivers can you assign next Monday without overtime?" Chloe lifted her chin. "Our expanded recruiting pipeline positions us to meet regional demand." "How many?" She returned to percentages and projected hires. No number came. Heather did not endorse me. The lender representatives reviewed the cash flow. The board representatives reviewed the staffing records. Chloe's answer had confirmed what the files already showed. She still treated a promise as capacity. I signed the offer. "It expires in 5 business days. The preparation might produce no acquisition. My parents could choose liquidation over allowing me to lead. Accepting that possibility was part of keeping the offer real." Dad slid the folder back with a proposed side letter tucked inside. One clause preserved Chloe as brand president with an office, salary, and public title. I drew a line through the clause, closed the folder, and returned it to him. "The deadline stays Friday." The deadline stayed Friday. So did the pressure. On Tuesday morning, Havenline's receptionist called my office. Judith Ellison is in the public lobby, she said. She doesn't have an appointment. She says it concerns the transaction. My hand tightened around the cane resting against my desk. The last time Mom had demanded a private conversation, there had been an overlook behind me. Keep the staff door locked, I said. Tell security she may have 10 minutes in the conference room beside reception. Talia will attend. The room had glass walls, an unobstructed exit, and a security employee visible across the lobby. Talia sat beside the door without speaking. I took the chair nearest the exit and started the timer on my phone. Choosing to receive her did not mean surrendering the precautions that kept me safe. The distinction mattered. 6 years earlier, refusing her had ended with my body below a mountain path. Now every entrance, witness, and exit belonged to a decision I had made before she crossed the room. Mom entered carrying no documents. You would rather humiliate your own mother than save elderly people, she said. What is your transaction question? After everything I did for you, you're taking our offices, Chloe's title, your father's income. Those are not questions. Her expression softened with practiced speed. Mara. I regret how that birthday ended. Can't we discuss this as mother and daughter? No, Ellison relative remains in management. The public correction stays. The offer expires Friday. One mistake should not erase a lifetime. The meeting is over. Mom remained seated. I stood carefully, picked up my cane, and opened the door. Please escort Miss Ellison out. Security acted only after I gave the instruction. Talia did not argue on my behalf. She simply witnessed Mom refusing the limit and me enforcing it. That afternoon, Dad sent a revised side letter requesting a paid advisor title and permanent office access. I rejected it in writing. Ruth left a voicemail calling the sale punishment disguised as business. She did not mention the unpaid overtime, the missed visits, or the debt. Every expression of regret arrived attached to a request for access, status, money, or silence. Thursday night, I instructed Havenline's transition team to maintain 2 plans, one for closing and one for walking away. Owning Ellison would not be worth teaching my staff that my need to win outweighed the conditions protecting them. On Friday morning, Heather called before 7. Chloe signed an extension with one of the failing contract partners, she said. It wasn't disclosed to the transition team. The extension was not leverage. It was another promise Ellison lacked the workforce to keep. An emergency meeting began an hour later. Chloe sat across from me with Dad beside her. Heather attended for the lender, and the contract representative joined by video. The extension increases recurring revenue, Chloe said. That raises the purchase price. If Havenline expects to keep the partner, I stay as relationship executive. I turned to the staffing certification attached to the agreement. It claimed Ellison had enough deployable workers to meet the new service level. Please provide the roster of trained caregivers available for next Monday, I said. Chloe opened a presentation. We have a strong recruiting pipeline across all service areas. That is not a roster. More than 60 people have entered orientation. How many completed training, cleared every requirement, and accepted shifts under this extension? She changed slides. Our candidate engagement rate is above the regional average. The contract representative interrupted. We need a number. Chloe looked toward Dad. He did not answer for her. The certification counted applicants and orientation attendees as available workers, the same substitution that had inflated Ellison's capacity before the collapse. The extension required current trained staffing to be disclosed. Without a corrected certification, Heather confirmed that the lender would not finance the added obligation. The representative asked how many clients could lose established care if the extension failed after launch. Chloe answered with a percentage about projected retention. I answered with the actual service areas, available supervisors, and trained reserve workers. The difference was not merely language. Her slide treated care as revenue that would somehow summon labor. My plan began with the people who would enter each home. Dad pulled the agreement toward him. What exposure does termination create? The contract representative named the service credits and exit cost. Both were smaller than the losses Ellison would incur by failing after launch. Dad turned to Heather. Is there any refinancing structure left if the extension remains? Not one supported by the verified cash flow, Heather said. No one had become generous. The numbers had simply removed the room where their claims used to stand. I revised the bid to exclude the unsupported extension. Then I addressed the contract representative. Havenline can begin with less than half the proposed volume, limited to 2 service areas. We can increase only after trained capacity is verified. The rates stay the same, but the expansion schedule changes. Chloe leaned forward. You'll lose them with an offer that small. The representative muted the call while conferring with someone off-screen. When she returned, she said, "We accept the reduced transition plan, subject to the sale closing today." Honesty had preserved the relationship Chloe's larger promise had endangered. By early afternoon, the board and transition representatives had assembled. Dad read the alternatives into the record. Havenline could purchase the operating company. Ellison could sell selected assets, causing major client disruption and large lease losses. Or the board could close branches, lose the remaining contracts, and allow creditors to control what followed. Mom demanded that Chloe receive a guaranteed executive position. She built the expansion, Mom said. That is why the position is unavailable, I replied. Chloe's hands flattened on the table. This company is my future. No one is entitled to a job she cannot perform safely. The sale passed because the contract failures and Chloe's final extension had eliminated the refinancing alternative. It was not handed to me. Havenline used retained earnings for the equity portion and a conventional acquisition loan sized to the conservative cash flow expected after consolidation. The purchase price did not treat 6 office signs as 6 healthy branches. 4 service areas still had enough clients and trained caregivers to remain viable. Fewer than 100 active caregivers remained from a workforce that had once been nearly twice that size. Secured debt came first. Then, employee obligations, lease exits, service credits, and the transition reserve. Mom, Dad, Chloe, and Ruth received only the lawful remainder after those claims. It was far below the payout they had expected when Chloe began expanding, but I did not take assets outside the transaction or erase money legally owed to them. Heather placed the loan schedule beside the closing page. The payments were supported by conservative post-transition earnings, but only if the 4 viable areas retained clients and the integration stayed within its reserve. If the transition failed, Havenline's growth would slow for years, and the company I had built would carry the damage. No lender had erased that risk because my story was compelling. The financing existed because our records, retention, cash flow, and limits supported it. Talia had approved the operating plan with the leadership team, but the signature accepting the purchase risk was mine. My signature activated a debt payment, 4 branch integrations, hundreds of care schedules, and the responsibility to keep payroll moving while the systems changed. The pen did not feel like a trophy. It felt like weight I had chosen, with both eyes open. After the closing representatives collected the final pages, Chloe stayed in her chair. "You were waiting to take this from me," she said. Winter rain struck the boardroom windows. My ankle had tightened during the long meeting, so I stood with the cane visible in my hand. 6 years earlier, they had expected me to disappear so Chloe could occupy that room. Now I had entered it through a purchase they had been free to reject. "No," I said. "I spent 6 years building something strong enough to buy what you broke." The transition schedule appeared on the screen behind me. It removed every Ellison relative from management, suspended unsupported expansion, protected employee pay and benefits, and placed client continuity ahead of publicity. Chloe looked at the access removal page. "I didn't push you." "No," you smiled, accepted my job, and used what came after. Mom shifted in her chair. Dad lowered his eyes to the closing packet. I did not turn the meeting into a trial about the overlook. My account of Mom's shove remained separate from the business record. The records established that Chloe had designed and exploited the professional removal, Dad had approved it, and Ruth had endorsed the succession, while expecting me to absorb the cost. The public correction was already prepared from the verified records. It stated that I had not abandoned clients. All 42 accepted reassignments had been excluded from an artificially frozen management snapshot, and the resignation announcement had been prepared before the birthday trip. The correction did not claim those records proved who pushed me. They did not need to. "This goes out today," I said. From my laptop, I authorized distribution to employees, clients, contract partners, and the same public channels Ellison had used to announce my supposed resignation. No publicist softened the chronology. No one added a claim the records could not support. My name returned to the record through fax rather than a demand that anyone admire me. Mom stood. "Before you publish anything, we need a private conversation." "No. You cannot buy a company and erase your parents. The purchase gives me authority over company access. Your future personal access depends on accountability, not ownership." System accounts closed at the time listed in the transition notice. Badges were collected. Offices were inventoried under the supervision of the transition representatives. Chloe's brass chief executive nameplate remained on the table. For a second, I remembered her expression at the overlook and Dad's hand closing around the crystal award. Then I placed the nameplate in the exit box with her personal belongings. There was nothing to smash. Her own contracts had already broken the authority attached to it. The next morning, the boardroom doors opened to caregivers, schedulers, and client representatives. People who had previously entered only to deliver reports took seats at the table. "For the first 90 days, we are protecting continuity and payroll," I told them. "No expansion campaign will outrank a staffed visit." A caregiver near the end of the table raised her hand. "Does protected rest mean there will be no overtime?" "It means overtime cannot be the permanent staffing plan," I said. "Emergency hours must be voluntary, paid, tracked, and followed by protected recovery time. If the numbers require the same people to rescue every week, we reduce capacity." One of the schedulers asked whether the council could stop a sales commitment before it reached the calendar. "If verified staffing does not support it, yes." The answer transferred more than a voice. It transferred the power to prevent the kind of promise Chloe had repeatedly forced others to carry. The new Workforce Council received written authority to review scheduling limits, overtime patterns, training requirements, and safety concerns before growth decisions were approved. Capacity reports would show trained workers, accepted hours, absences, and turnover, not applicants presented as staff. A staged profit-sharing plan would begin after the transition reserve reached its target. Giving the council authority reduced the number of decisions that belonged to me alone. That was the point. Ellison had depended on one daughter, absorbing every emergency, while another held the title. Havenline would not depend on a different indispensable woman, even if that woman was me. After the meeting, Talia followed me to the lobby. The Crystal Award still stood beneath the plaque, crediting the old leadership team. We removed the false plaque. The original engraving remained intact, for keeping every promise when no one was watching. The award did not return to my office. It went into the caregiver break room beside a new card listing the workers whose confirmations had been hidden 6 years earlier, and the teams who had preserved care during the transition. "Are you renaming Ellison?" Talia asked. "Not yet. Workers and clients lived with that name longer than I owned it. They get a voice in what comes next." The responses from my relatives arrived separately. Dad requested a consulting title, arguing that his institutional knowledge would ease the transition. The answer was a formal refusal and instructions to direct necessary transaction questions through the closing process. Mom sent a letter describing herself as a mother who had made one mistake during a painful argument. My reply contained 3 sentences. "You pushed me after I refused to sign a false resignation. You have continued to blame my refusal for your action. Future personal contact requires you to acknowledge both facts without asking me to rewrite either one." Chloe emailed to ask whether she might work for the company again someday. "Employment cannot be used as a path to reconciliation," I wrote. "No application from you will be considered during the transition period. Any future personal relationship is a separate question and requires sustained accountability." Ruth refused to retract her testimonial. Her message said history would remember which granddaughter preserved the Ellison legacy. I arranged one final transfer of her care records to the coordinator she had chosen, with Ruth's written authorization. After that, I stopped scheduling, paying, and negotiating on her behalf. No one received forgiveness because signatures had changed ownership. Each person received a boundary matched to what she or he had done. That evening, my phone did not ring with a request from a relative. The quiet felt strange, then spacious. Part of me had once believed that winning the company would finally make them understand what they had done. Their separate responses ended that hope. Ownership could change access, payroll, policy, and the public record. It could not force remorse into people who still treated accountability as a price they should be allowed to negotiate. Letting go of that expectation was the last cost of the purchase and the first part of it that made me feel free. 6 months later, service reliability had improved. Expansion remained slower, caregiver turnover was falling, and the 4 supportable service areas operated without forced overtime as their default solution. Weather still reached the metal in my ankle before the forecast reached my phone. A folding cane rested beside my desk. Screen breaks and rehabilitation appointments appeared on my calendar as commitments no employee could override, including me. One evening, I closed my laptop while daylight still touched the windows. The boardroom door stood open after a workforce council meeting. Down the hall, the Crystal Award caught the break room light not as proof that I could save everyone alone, but as a reminder that promises survived when respected people carried them together. A scheduling alert sounded from the operations room. My hand paused above the office light switch. Then another voice answered the alert. A trained evening scheduler contacted the reserve caregiver, updated the client, and closed the gap without calling me. The system worked, while I stood outside it. Talia passed my doorway with her coat over one arm. Going home? Yes. I turned off the light, left the building at a reasonable hour, and did not look back for another problem to solve. The company was mine now, but for the first time in my life did not belong to the company.